to hear your questions. I want to make sure I meet them. So we'll just start off with kind of the beginning of where I started hearing questions coming from. So development of the nervous system. So we're not getting into the details. All I want you to really understand about development of the nervous system is that its development is segmental. So we have spinal nerves coming out of specific regions of the spinal cord, and they are following along in developmental outgrowth with the somites here. So the somites are just embryological blobs of tissue at first. They're just growing out along the edge of the neural tube in the embryo, and from those we start getting muscles of the limbs and the back and the trunk, and so as those muscles grow out, those nerves are growing out with them. Okay, so yes.
So the nerves follow the somites.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and so they're following that developmental trajectory. So all of it's kind of growing out together, developing together. And so the whole point of talking about that really is to understand why we have this map of dermatomyotomes. Okay, so each of these dermatomyotomes is the outgrowth of the somites, right? And so we can say at each dermatomyotome, say L5 here, that is the muscle and the skin that grew out from the somite at the L5 level, and it also includes the afferent and efferent fibers of the L5 spinal nerve for the somatic portion of that nerve. So really it's just illustrating why we have these regions of innervation throughout the whole body. Does that make more sense now? Any questions? Yes?
Do we just need to kind of memorize this figure of where they're located, or do we need to know what myotome makes your arm raise up and stuff like that?
I don't think it's really necessary to know each individual dermatomyotome, because you're going to learn that better if you become, if you do like a neurological emphasis after graduation. What I want you to know is the concept. Where, and if I gave you this figure, could you then say, okay, if I give you this figure and I say, okay, there's a lesion at the T8 level, can you tell me what areas you would have loss of motor function and sensory input?
Okay.
That's what I want you to understand from this figure.
So then that would just be that whole T section on that.
So if you have it at the T8, T9 level, I think that's what I said before, anything below that level then would have a problem, because you have your signals from the spinal cord are going down from the brain, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so you would have loss of function below that level. If you have, say, impingement of a spinal nerve, let's say your L2 spinal nerve is impinged, so it's getting pinched, then you would have loss of function in just this dermatomyotome. So you'd have numbness and pain and tingling and lack of motor tone and all of that, depending on the severity of the impingement in that particular myotome. Yes.
So you're not expecting us to know exactly like where each one of this are, just kind of know how it works and what the consequences are of. Okay.
Exactly. So know the consequences of lesion at each spinal cord level, and remember, it's just anything below that level is going to be compromised,
including that level too, right?
Depending on
where the lesion is.
Where the lesion is, whether it includes the spinal nerve roots.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are there any exceptions to that rule? Or are there any places that it's different than that, or is it always going to affect just below it?
It will always affect below it to some degree. Mm-hmm. If it depends exactly on the location of the lesion. So say we've got our spinal cord here, and we've got the little blobs here, and we've got spinal nerves coming out here and here. Okay, if you have a lesion, say, on this portion right here, you're only going to get loss of function from that area. So this would be anterior, posterior. That would be motor function on the contralateral side of that. And someone's, yeah, so it doesn't cross over. So know that you would have problems with whatever neurons are originating here and traveling out. You would have some loss of function. Now, if the lesion is here along the spinal nerve and actually doesn't reach the spinal cord itself, then instead of having problems below the site of injury, you would just have problems within the particular dermatomyotome of the injury. Okay. Does that make sense? Any other questions about dermatomyotomes? All right, one down. We're good. All right. So then the next thing I think we had some issues with was the differences between autonomic, somatic, and visceral, all of those different segments of the nervous system. So this is where there's a lot of overlap in definitions. So we can say, in general, somatic, sensory, and somatic motor is conscious and voluntary. Okay? So somatic motor systems are your voluntary skeletal muscles, things that you can actually control. Okay? When we're talking about the visceral sensory, though some of that is conscious pain, it's typically a referred pain because of the convergence of the visceral pain neurons and the somatic pain neurons. But we're talking about sensory systems from the visceral organs, so the internal organs. And then special sensory, that would be eyesight and smell and taste, which have specific pathways into the brain. They don't go through the typical somatic sensory or visceral sensory pathways. Then we get to autonomic, and autonomic is predominantly a motor thing. It receives input from visceral sensory and special sensory and somatic sensory. All of those feed into the autonomic input, the inputs to the autonomic nervous system. But the autonomic nervous system itself is a motor system. It's driving changes in your body, and this is involuntary. And it has three different parts. It has the sympathetic, which is ramping up your body's response to a threatening stimulus. Parasympathetic, which kind of tones it down back to normal, maintains that more normal baseline level of activity in each of the organs. And then those two contribute to the input to the enteric nervous system, which, though it's part of the autonomic nervous system, is kind of off on its own and can operate dominantly on its own, but receives input from the rest of the autonomic nervous system as to the levels of activity in those ganglia neurons. Okay, does that separate them out a little bit better? Any questions about that? Yeah.
So is the autonomic mostly visceral then? Not?
It's mostly visceral, but it also affects non-visceral organs too. So it affects the muscles in your skin. That's why when you get scared, all of your hair stands up on end. That's your autonomic nervous system affecting it. It's going to affect blood flow to your muscles because it's going to be anticipating your need to run away from a frightening situation, things like that. Okay, good question. Any other questions? Okay. Now, as far as go for here, exciting and wonderful world of plexuses. So plexuses in general are important when you need a lot of inputs, integration of inputs into a particular organ, and a lot of control of those inputs. So areas with complex innervation, so like the arms for the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus going to control lower limbs, sacral plexus controlling genitalia and bowel and all of that. Complex situations need the complex nervous innervation. So you need to know these, and the reason you need to know these is because as a practitioner, eventually you're going to be dealing with problems in these different areas of the body. So brachial plexus problems with arm function, if you go into that area of medicine, and knowing the plexuses that control these are going to help you be able to work backwards and understand what's going wrong. And that's especially true with the visceral section, with the visceral plexuses. So knowing where their innervation is coming from is going to help you understand the whole problem when you're dealing with some sort of abnormality or of function. Okay?
So we need to know the function of that specific plexus as well, like the lumbar plexus.
So you need to know the plexus, and if it specifies which spinal nerves it's from, you should know that, because then that will tell you, okay, if I have an injury at this level, it will then the cervical plexus be disturbed. Oh yes, so if you have a C3, C4 lesion, yes, you're going to have some problems with the cervical plexus, and that's going to help you with your understanding of the patient's problems. Does that make more sense? Question?
Is it right to think about a plexus as like new nerves formed from spinal nerves, like spinal nerves come together to make new nerves?
That's not quite accurate. It's more a network of interconnections of those nerves. I would say that's more.
They're branches from the nerve, right?
Yeah, there are lots of interconnecting branches from the spinal nerves. Any other questions? Okay, are there any other areas in the nervous system where you guys were like, what the heck is she talking about? or you had some questions? Yeah.
As far as your cranial nerves go, do we just need to know the cranial nerves and the ganglia that they innervate, or do we need to know the actual name of the cranial nerves and what they're doing, like constricting your pupil and stuff like that?
Yeah, so you should know the cranial nerve number. I can never remember the names of them. So eventually you'll get those because they'll use those names more often than they'll use the number designations. And know which ganglion they innervate, and then also know the effector organ. So that whole pathway, that's an important one. Because it's going to again help you put the function of that organ and how the nervous system is able to control it into a full picture.
So this picture says the parasympathetic part of the autonomic division. So does that mean the heart? Does all of this is part of the parasympathetic system?
Okay, so the parasympathetic part of the system innervates most of the same organs as the sympathetic nervous system does. It's just doing the opposite thing in many instances. So it's like, say, with the bowel, sympathetic nervous system is kind of shut down bowel activity because you don't need that when you're running away from the grizzly bear that's chasing you. Parasympathetic system, after you've hidden behind the tree and the bear's gone from barreling past you, is going to kind of tone things down a little bit and get the peristalsis and all of that working again. Because it's like, oh, okay, I need to recover from this now. It's okay to expend energy digesting food, because I don't have to expend all my energy running away from a 300-pound angry hunk of muscle. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah, any other questions? Okay, anything else in the nervous system that you had big question marks for? Yeah. Yeah, so you need to know the splanchnic nerves. They're really important ones to know for visceral function and all that. Any other questions? Are we ready to forge ahead into back anatomy then? Okay. right, so the back. Think of it as, very punnily described, the backbone of the body. It's the central support system of the body. So here, in this slide, it just spells out the basic functions of different regions of the vertebral column, which is one of the major portions of the back, obviously. So in the cervical region, we have support and movement of the head. So supporting the head on top of the vertebral column, muscle and ligament attachments to both enable and restrict range of movement of the head to make sure that you have not too much, not too little, all of that. And also, that's the avenue of communication via the spinal cord from the brain to the rest of the body. Thoracic region, so we have, again, support of the entire vertebral column as part of it. Support for the thorax, so part of the thoracic column, vertebral column is support for the pectoral girdle, so the shoulder girdle, and also ribs in the thoracic region. Lumbar supports the abdomen, also is part of the support system coming down into the pelvic region, sacral region here, and allowing for muscle attachment and support of the lower limbs via the pelvic girdle. All right, so one of the features of the vertebral column, which is amazing to me, is the curvature. So as an embryo, as a new infant, and even as a young child, the predominant curvature is convex posteriorly. So there's no secondary curvature at all. It's just one big curve. But as the individual develops, we start getting secondary curvatures in the cervical and lumbar areas. And what that does is moves the center of gravity forward so that it centers precisely on the center of the vertebral column. So that way, with all of the weight of the structures that are resting on the vertebral column, it's balanced so that it's the tipping point where the least amount of muscular activity is required to maintain an upright bipedal posture. So that curvature allows that balance point to be just right in order to maintain upright posture. So I think it's pretty cool. Things can go wrong with this curvature, so you can have excessive bending in the thoracic region, which is called kyphosis. So extra curvature there. Or you can have excessive curvature in the lumbar spine, which is called lordosis. And those are typically, can be genetic deformations of vertebral structure, but often is also a problem with degeneration of the joint, of the bones too. So that's kind of a front to back curvature problem. Scoliosis is another example of curvature of the spine that's gone awry. So that's a lateral curvature. That's a problem. This can be abnormalities in ligaments and in the bone structure themselves, often developmental, but amazing can be largely corrected through surgical procedures, which is awesome. Very, very cool. So no definitions of kyphosis, lordosis, and scoliosis for curvatures of the spine.
Is the scoliosis usually the lateral curvature of the thoracic, or any? Or
it can be any portion of the spine. Depends on how severe it is, but it's lateral, and then there's a lot of times there's a rotational component to it. But I probably won't be quite that picky on my exam. Okay, so then we've got the next layer, which is the muscles. And so we've got several different layers. We've got a deep layer of muscles. They're the intrinsic muscles, innervated by the posterior rami, or branches of the spinal nerves. And these are predominantly responsible for posture maintenance. We also have the intrinsic muscles, which are composed of an intermediate and superficial group. These are innervated by the anterior branches of the spinal nerves, and function predominantly in support of the rest of the body, the trunk. So trunk support. That's supposed to be a K. And limb movement. All right. We'll get into the muscles more. Just a quick overview of them, of the different layers. And they are what allow, so there's those intrinsic muscles and the intermediate layers allow for the flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and rotation of the vertebral column, which is the major movements available for the vertebral column. So just know those terms in relation to the vertebral column. Pretty simple slide for once. All right, another major function of the vertebral column in the back is protection and housing of the nervous system. So, like I said, the spinal cord travels down the center of the vertebral column. We have spinal nerves exiting at every vertebral level, and so it has multiple mechanisms for protecting the spinal cord. It's got the vertebral canal here, which we'll talk about more later. There's layers of meninges, which are the protective connective tissue layer between the spinal cord or the brain and the external structures, and also cerebrospinal fluid, that fluid that helps cushion everything. And just a random picture of a dissected out nervous system, which I think is awesome, because I'm a nerd like that. So you can see the paravertebral ganglia on each side of the spinal cord here. I'll erase these so you can see that. And then all of the nerves extending out away from that. So that's kind of an overview, functions, basic idea of what's going on. Now let's really get into the anatomy. So in the vertebral column itself, we have 33 different vertebrae, different sections of the vertebrae. So the cervical, the first 7. We have the next 12 are the thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae. The sacrum is 5 fused sacral vertebrae, and sometimes there's variations in whether they get completely fused or not, with some of the anatomical variations you may see. And then finally the coccyx, which is 3 to 4 fused vertebrae at the end of the vertebral column. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the structure of these 3 types of vertebrae. I will leave these out. There's a lot we could talk about, but I can only talk about so much. So we'll have to leave those for a later date. Just know that they're fused, sections of fused vertebrae. Okay, so overall vertebral anatomy. So here we have the vertebral body. And here, this is the major weight-bearing portion of the vertebra. So it's what's actually stacked up on top of each other. And you can kind of think of it as like a stack of blocks in a way. And I know we've all probably played with stacking some sort of block-like structure. How stable is that on its own? Not terribly, right? So in addition to this vertebral body that actually allows for weight bearing, we have the vertebral arch, which allows for more interarticulation of the vertebrae, help stabilize the vertebrae, as well as providing the vertebral canal for the spinal cord to travel through. So the different parts of the vertebral arch. So we start off with a short little peg right here coming from the posterior side of the vertebral body. This is the pedicle, and it's basically just a connection between the vertebral body and the lamina, which is a flat-ish plate of bone that travels from the pedicle to the midline, posterior midline of the vertebral arch. Gesundheit. Those lamina during development are growing out, and they then fuse at the midline, and the spinous process comes out of them. And the spinous process is really important detachment point for ligaments and muscles. So another really important attachment point for ligaments and muscles is the transverse process coming out from the pedicle here. You can see on this image here a little bit better the superior articular process and inferior articular process. These two processes are part of what links the vertebrae together. So the inferior articular process of one vertebrae articulates with the superior articular process of the vertebra below it. And that kind of helps link them together. Let's see, oh yes, here. Superior vertebral arch or notch and the inferior vertebral notch are just concave portions of the bone on either side of the pedicle, on the superior and inferior surfaces of the pedicle, and allow for exiting of the spinal nerve, which we'll see in a moment. So if we take and then turned that vertebral body so that we're looking at it from like a superior aspect, we see here's the vertebral body here again, and here is the posterior aspect of the vertebral arch. The pedicles would be down here underneath or above, depending on exactly where we've cut this vertebral body, the exit point for the spinal nerves there. And you can see here in the vertebral canal where the spinal cord is housed with its cerebral spinal fluid here. It has extra fat, so in the extradural space, which helps cushion it, as well as all the meninges. Okay, so that's basic vertebral anatomy. Know what each part is and what its purpose is. Okay. Also, just to make sure we catch on this, make sure you know the walls of the the vertebral canal. So the anterior wall is the posterior part of the vertebral body, and the lateral and posterior walls are made up of the laminae and the pedicles here. Okay. So then here's just a better illustration of how they interlock together. So we see here the interlocking of the superior articular process with the inferior articular process. And that is what we call the zygapophyseal joint. And it is a synovial joint, so it actually has articular membrane around the joint surface and synovial fluid and all that jazz in there. And you can say here, the intervertebral foramen, where we have the inferior vertebral arch or notch and the superior vertebral notch coming to form the roof and floor of that foramen, respectively. The lateral walls are the vertebral body there, and then portions of the lamina and the zygapophyseal joint. Okay, so the purpose of this slide is to illustrate the intervertebral foramen. Let's see, where are we going now? Oh yes, so now I want to talk a little bit about the differences in the shapes of the different vertebrae, the different level. So here we have the cervical vertebrae on top, and they can be distinguished by a circular vertebral body. Roughly, I think it looks more like a bean myself, but they say it's circular. A bifid spinous process, so two prongs coming out of it. And the foramen transversarium, which is a foramen or a smooth-edged hole in the transverse process, and this is where a lot of the vertebral vessels flow. They go right through that foramen. Another typical characteristics is the triangular shape of the vertebral arch. Okay, so those are the important aspects to know. And can somebody tell me, why are we worried about what shape these are? What is it going to help you as a clinician?
Identify, like when you're taking an X-ray or a CT or something, you identify what part of the body you're looking at depending on the vertebra.
Absolutely. That's one of the major ways we identify where we're at in a CT scan or an MRI or X-ray. Yes, very good. Okay, so thoracic vertebrae, they are predominantly identified by the presence of an articulating rib. So that means it's a rib that's a separate bone, actually having joints with the vertebra at the vertebral body and on the transverse processes. So that's one of the major identifying characteristics. The other one is that the vertebral body is roughly heart-shaped. It's supposed to be an A. And the vertebral canal or arch is circular. So that's thoracic vertebrae. And then finally, lumbar vertebrae, they are identified by their size, so they're large compared to the other vertebrae. They have no articulating surfaces for ribs. The vertebral body is circular. And they predominantly have long, thin transverse processes. The exception to that is, I think it's L5, where its transverse processes are big, cone-shaped sort of structures, and they're bigger because a lot of the iliolumbar ligaments and muscles attached to that to maintain good connection between the pelvic girdle and the lumbar spine. Okay, so characteristics, basic idea, just so that you'll be able to identify where you're at in one of those medical images, diagnostic images. Okay? So a couple of exceptions to the cervical vertebrae are the atlas and the axis, so C1 and C2. And they are specially shaped in order to optimally perform their function. So C1 vertebrae, atlas, what is its function?
Hold the head.
Hold up the head. And so its predominant structures are specifically designed for that. So we have the facet for the occipital condyle, so the two of the bones here on the base of your skull are kind of larger and bean-shaped and a little bit concave, but that allows for nodding of the head in that joint, okay? It's arch-shaped. It doesn't have a vertebral body associated with it, though embryologically the dens is actually the C1 vertebral body, even though it's actually fused to the C2 vertebra. It has posterior arch and an anterior arch to kind of connect the two via the lateral masses here. So here's the lateral masses. And we have tubercles on the anterior and posterior arches to provide muscle attachment and ligament attachment points. Also, we have here the facet for the dens. So when the C2 and C1 are articulated together, you see here is the facet for the dens here. The dens is right here next to it, held in place by the transverse ligament of the atlas. Okay, so it's a pretty simple bone compared to all of the processes and all that of the rest of them, but it's optimized for its job of cradling the skull and then articulating with the C2 vertebra to allow for rotation. So that the joint between the atlas and the axis is called the atlantoaxial joint. That is then optimized for rotation of the head. So we have the dens acting as a pivot, going into the slot that's formed by the facet for the dens and the transverse ligament of the atlas. It has round facets that then articulate with the inferior facets of the atlas, and those allow, again, for some movement back and forth. We also have several ligaments tightened together. We'll talk more about them next class period, but we just want to mention the alar ligaments, holding them together, posterior longitudinal ligament, kind of, again, holding everything in place. And here you can see the articular process between the occipital condyle and the superior facet for the occipital condyle on the atlas.
The
And-
posterior longitudinal ligament that goes across the whole spine, right? Like,
Yeah, it goes from the skull all the way down to the sacrum. We'll talk about that more later. Okay, so just know that these specialized structures, know why they're important, what these particular special and anatomical features are doing for the anatomy and the physiology, okay? All right, so then a couple of notes about the lumbar spine, which are important for clinicians. So here you can see in the thoracic spine, there is a solid bony wall pretty much on the posterior aspect of the vertebra. So very, very tight connections between the vertebral arches. Whereas in the lumbar vertebrae, you see there's spaces here between the vertebral arches. And this allows for access to the spinal cord and the vertebral canal for things like lumbar puncture, aka spinal taps. So, and also epidural anesthesia. So that allows us to puncture that area with the needle and inject the anesthesia right into the cerebral spinal fluid surrounding that area of in the vertebral canal, and also to withdraw the cerebral spinal fluid for like a lumbar puncture, spinal tap. Okay, so very unique aspect of the lumbar vertebrae, and that gap as we go down through the lumbar vertebrae gets bigger as we go. Come on, there we go. Okay, so what happens when things go wrong? Well, this is one way these things can go wrong. This is spina bifida. Oh, can't write today. Oh, wait, that's every day. And here's an example of an infant with spina bifida. So during development, if the mother does not have enough folic acid, the vertebral arches are more likely to not fuse together. So that whole posterior aspect of the vertebral column will not fuse together. And you'll get outpouching of at least the meninges, so that would be a meningeal seal, or if it's in a more severe case, outpouching of also the portions of the spinal cord as well into these pouches here on the infant's back. And this is predominantly in the lumbar spine area. And there's not a whole lot we can do about it, unfortunately. Okay, so that is vertebral anatomy. Any questions about vertebral anatomy? No? Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about the joints in the last 10 minutes of class. So we've got 6 joints per vertebral, per vertebra. There we go. So we have 2 symphyses, and remember those are a solid joint, and those are here on the superior and inferior sides of the vertebral body. So each vertebral body is lined on the superior and inferior aspects with a layer of hyaline cartilage. And then on top or beneath that, so in between those layers of hyaline cartilage, we have the intervertebral disc. And does anybody remember what the intervertebral disc is predominantly composed of?
Fibrocartilage.
Fibrocartilage, exactly. So there's two different portions of it. The annulus fibrosus is the fibrocartilage part. It's very highly infused with collagen and elastin fibers, and they are arranged in layers where the layers have different directions here, each different layer. So they call a lamellar arrangement. And they then surround a center gelatinous portion called the nucleus pulposus. And the nucleus pulposus, very gelatinous, very good for absorbing compressive forces. So the purpose of the nucleus pulposus is to absorb compression forces, like I just said. I cannot spell today. And the annulus fibrosus is typically resisting rotation. And overflexion. Or extension. Okay. And often the annulus fibrosus is kind of melds with, is almost continuous with some of the ligaments that surround that joint as well, to add extra strength. Okay, the other joints are the four articulating processes, the inferior and superior articulating processes here. That one's back there. And these are, oh wait, I was going to talk about that. Okay. So these are synovial joints, like I said before, and they are called the zygapophyseal joint. So as long as you know what they're called, it's good enough. All right, so here's an example of something that can go wrong. This is a herniated disc here. And this is when you have a tear in the annulus fibrosus, and the nucleus pulposus starts coming out of it, and can then intrude into the vertebral canal, as you can see here. Also, you can have lateral herniations that actually intrude more onto the intervertebral foramen and compress the spinal nerve. So when you get compression of these nervous system structures, you then start having pain, numbness, tingling, all of that good stuff, whatever is going to be impaired by that compression. So motor function sometimes as well. And so here is an example of an MRI. You can see here the spinal cord, and you can see a protrusion here of the disc into that vertebral canal. Come on, there we go. Okay, so here let's talk about the zygapophyseal joints again. So part of their purpose is to interlock those vertebrae and also to limit the range of motion. And you imagine if we didn't have those and just had ligaments holding together this stack of blocks, we'd have probably a lot harder time limiting the range of motion with those ligaments, and muscles have a lot more tears and injuries to them. But with these articulating processes here, the zygapophyseal joint, it helps restrict it with less chance of injury. So we have in the cervical, they are sloped anterior and posteriorly, and that allows for both extension and flexion of that joint because it's a little bit less vertical. So you can have sliding of the joint both directions. In the thoracic spine, these are more vertical and actually restricts the amount of flexion and extension that can happen in the spine in that area. And then finally in the lumbar area, they're actually, this joint is actually a little bit more curved and interlocking, which really restricts the motion. So You can see here the surfaces are a little bit more curved, they're rotated, and that helps stabilize the lumbar spine, which takes a lot of compressive forces. Okay, any questions on these? Pretty straightforward? Okay. All right, so then we can have some problems happening with the interarticulation of the vertebra. Wow, I'm saying it all wrong all the time. Get my emphases right. And a common injury, especially with athletes, is in with this structure here called the pars interarticulatus. And this is the area between the superior and inferior articulating processes. And often that can get fractured. And you see here, here's a normal vertebra right here. You can see vertebral body, a nice solid vertebral arch coming posterior from it. But you can see here on the, erase that one here. On the vertebra below, we have the vertebral body, but we see here's the fracture here, the pars interarticulatus fracture, articularis fracture. And that allows the vertebral body to slide forward. You can see here the mismatch between the anterior aspects of the vertebral bodies, which can then cause impingement of the spinal cord in that area, and often require fixation through like plates and rods and things like that. Okay, so that is one thing that could go wrong. Oop, all right, so that is it. Any questions about what we've covered today? All right. Oh, you get 3 minutes out 3 minutes early. Congratulations to you. And we'll see you tomorrow.